so let's get in with our first lesson, and we're going to be talking about meshes today. And so if you have some experience with game development or even just playing games, you probably understand what a mesh is. It's like a 3D geometry that's made out of triangles, and so that's why it's called a mesh. Is that it's a mesh of triangles. Um, and so, like the common way you would make a cube, for example, in a triangle mesh is that you'd have something like this, right? Um, and then you could just, you could split these faces kind of in many different ways to create triangles out of them. But this would kind of define the geometry of a cube. And then you could add some shading to kind of understand maybe like how this is three-dimensional. And we're not going to do the shading stuff in this lesson. We will get to that in this unit. But this is the basic idea, right? The graphics card understands how to draw a triangle, and then from that triangle, right, so we can give some each shading to each side, and then we can understand, okay, this is like a 3D object, even though this is like a very rudimentary drawing. You can see why I like to use code to do my drawing and not my actual pen and paper here. So we could make a 3D cube as our lesson, but we're going to do something that's even simpler because we really just want to understand how are these meshes constructed in code, and what are the basic principles that go into that. And this is actually going to be kind of challenging if you have no background in graphics programming, and that's kind of the point here, is just to make it really simple as possible so that you understand the concepts at a basic level. So the thing that we want to actually model here is going to be just like the 2D version of this. So what I'm going to do is let's just draw what I want to model in code. So I want to do something that's kind of like this, where I've got these 4 points here that are, evenly spaced. And so I'm going to draw these 4 points, and then I'm going to kind of connect them here into like the box that I want, right? And then as I just did on this 3D version over here, I need to turn this into triangles. So I don't actually think it matters which way you do it. You could do it that way, or you could do it that way. Just since I did it first this way, let's do it that way. But I honestly, I don't think it actually matters. I mean, somebody can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I literally don't think this matters. So this is what we're going to want to make in code. And I find actually, since I'm working in MS Paint, it's actually really useful to draw stuff that you want to do in code, especially as you're first starting out, but even once you have some experience. If you just draw it out first, you'll kind of see what needs to be done, and you can kind of try to analyze and break down what you did analytically to turn that into a program. And so what I did basically was I drew these points, and let me just say like where I want these to be located in 2D space, right? So I mean, I'm going to say this is going to be like, let's start this at the 0 coordinate. So this would be 0, 0, and then it will go up to 1. So this would be like 0, 1, 1, 1, and 1, 0. And so this is kind of what we want to do with our code, but how are we going to do that? So let me just tell you first sort of what we need to provide the GPU in order to draw this. We need to provide it a vertex buffer, and we need to provide it an index buffer. So we're going to have a vertex buffer, index buffer. And so what are these two things? Well, let's first look at this word buffer. What is a buffer? The buffer is essentially an array. And what exactly is the difference? Honestly, I couldn't tell you exactly what the difference is. I think buffer is used more in a low-level context. It's basically a block of memory, but then again, so is an array. So it basically functions like an array, but you hear this a lot in a graphics context, buffer. Now, what are vertex and index? What are those referring to? So the vertex may be a little bit more intuitive for people who know what vertices are. Those are going to be these points. So I first set out by drawing these points. So my step 1 was draw a series of points, right? And then the index buffer is going to correspond to the second step that I did, which was that I then connected the dots, right? Or I connected them. And so now how does this correspond to a buffer or an array? Basically, we're going to put these points. So these are the vertices that we're putting into the mesh. And we're going to be creating an array that contains these points. So let's just draw out what that array is going to look like. So if I'm going, let's just do it in the order that I drew it. But honestly, none of this stuff really matters. I'll kind of highlight the part that matters, but the order you put them into this vertex buffer doesn't really matter. But since I did it in this order here, let's add those to our array. So as you notice, there's gonna be 4 points. So let's just draw what the array will look like, okay? And we're gonna subdivide this into 4, right? And then we're gonna have 0, 0 is gonna go into our first slot there. And then we're gonna have 0, 1, x-axis 0, y-axis 1. Then we're gonna go over here, 1, 1, and then we're gonna come back down to 1, 0. Okay, so that's our vertex buffer, or you can call it a vert buffer, right? And if you know about arrays, you'll know that they're 0 indexed, right? Which means that I can refer to this slot as index 0. And let me just actually change the color here so that you're not distracted by the fact that this also says 0, right? So I'm just going to say this is index 0, this is index 1, 2, and 3. So now we have our vertex buffer. So we did the first step, which is draw our points, provide the vertex buffer. Now what we want to do is create the index buffer. Index, well, what did I just say about I just used this word, right? And I have this color still highlighted. These are our indices, or indexes, but indices is the correct plural here, right? So the index buffer corresponds to connecting the points, as I said before. So what this means is when we provide the index buffer, this can also be thought of as a triangle buffer, but it's going to basically point to these vertices that we've already provided the GPU. It's going to point to them and say, okay, here's the order in which you want to connect them. And this part, order, does matter because you want to make sure that the winding order is the same for both of them. So if we're going to go in a clockwise direction, we want to go in a clockwise direction. We want to go to counterclockwise because the reason for that is that this face here could be pointing towards the camera, or it could be pointing away from the camera. And so that winding order will kind of determine that. Honestly, you can use this. There's like a right-hand rule or left-hand rule. I believe Unity uses a left-hand space, but honestly, I just kind of tend to just do one or the other and then see if it works. And then if it doesn't work, I flip it, right? So what I'm going to do is now provide the index buffer. So how do we do that? Well, to create these triangles that I drew before, what you want to do is connect this point to this point to this point. Then you want to connect this point to this point to this point, because there's 2 triangles. That's going to be 6 points you're connecting. 2 times 3. I did say there was going to be some math involved here. So there's going to be 6 indices that we want to put into our index buffer. So let's again go back to black here, and let's label this our index buffer. Okay, and then we're going to subdivide this not that way. We're going to have 3 on each side, right? So, and because we use this color for our indices up here, let's just label them in a different color here, right? So we go up to 5, index 5, which is the 6th element. And so now what we're going to do is put the points that we want to connect. We want to put the indices of those points into our index buffer. So again, we're going to connect this point to this point to this point. Well, that corresponds to these 3 points, right? Which is 0, 1, 2. So let's put 0, 1, 2 here. And then we want to connect this point to this point to this. And actually, why don't I just label these? So this will be index 0, and then this is 1, this is 2, and then this is 3, right? And so we want to connect 0, 1, 2, right? 0, 1, 2. Oh, wait, see, I did that wrong. So we don't want to go 0, 1, 2. We want to go 0, 1, 3. I mean, this is that 0, 1, 2 would have done that, right? Which is valid, but that's not what we're trying to do. So let's go back and correct that. And we'll change that to 0, 1, 3. And that will connect these points. And now what we wanted to do was connect these points, which is going to be 1, 2, 3. And you see, I did the same. We're going clockwise in both cases. Okay, so then we're going to go 1, 2, 3, and so that's what this vertex buffer, index buffer mean. And this can be kind of confusing. I know when I was first working with graphics, I did find this kind of confusing, especially. I mean, maybe understanding it on when you're drawing it on a blackboard or whatever, it makes kind of some sense. But when you're trying to actually work through the problems, it can be confusing because it's kind of meta. You're sort of saying, here's the data, and then here's essentially metadata, right? That corresponds to this. So that can get confusing, which is why it is really good. I mean, because like I just made a mistake, right? So it's good to use the like a drawing of some kind, just so that you can keep track of these things. But so that's basically how we would create a mesh, a square mesh with code. So with that, let's hop over to Unity and actually do that. Okay, so we're in Unity now, and here's a scene that just came with Unity. So I'm just going to delete this stuff out because we're not going to use this. And then let's create a scripts folder, and let's create a script in here. We'll use a mono behavior, and we'll just say quad. And what we're going to do is take what we did in Paint and translate that to our code. And rather than doing stuff in Start, let's just get rid of these methods. We're not going to actually use these. And let's just say like make mesh, or we'll call it build mesh. And let's also add a context menu so that we can just kind of play with this in the editor. And so let's say this thing needs a mesh renderer. It will need a mesh renderer, but we don't actually need to refer to it. We can just do this all later down here. So we can just say mesh filter mf equals get component mesh filter. So this is going to need to have a mesh filter on it. Okay. And so you could say require a component mesh filter, whatever. We're not going to do that in this course. Okay. We're sort of expecting that you are sort of familiar with Unity best practices and things like that. And so this is more of going to be just like a shorthand of illustrating how you would do these new concepts, integrate these new concepts into Unity. But yeah, I mean, if you're, anyway, I won't go off in a tangent, but yeah, this is typically not the type of thing you'd probably want to do. So we'll just create our new mesh. So here's where we're going to be integrating these new concepts. So let's actually use a generic collection here, and let's say, actually, we don't even need this. Okay, so let's just get our new mesh built here. So what we'll do is we'll create our, let's go back to our template here, and let's create our vertex buffer first. So we'll say that's going to be an array of vector 3s. So we'll call it verts, and we'll create it this way with a literal. No, I didn't want it to do that. We'll use the literal constructor, and we'll just put the, and I use vector 3s because that's what Unity is expecting, is 3-dimensional points, but we'll just throw a 0 into the Z axis. So we'll say, all right, our first one is going to be 0, 0, 0. So we can just do it that way. You could say vector 3.0 as well. And the next one's going to be 0, 1, 1, 1, and then 1, 0. Right? Come on, add the formatting. I didn't want to do that anyway. Okay, actually what we can do is we can just set that directly on the mesh, right? So we don't need to have this separate variable here. We can just set that on the mesh directly. And now, and that's the vertex buffer, right? In Unity, it refers to it as vertices. You're going to be able to, so you can see they have some settings for indices, but, or index buffer, right? If I put an index buffer, you see some stuff referring to that, but there are different formats of an index buffer that this accepts. But what you actually want to do is access this triangle. So you'll see here, it's an array of ints. And so that's the index buffer that we're using. You could set like a quad buffer or that type of thing. It's not going to use the same GPU acceleration. So let's use the triangles, and we'll do it. We'll initialize this the same way. Hopefully I get better at typing while I'm on camera as this thing goes on. Okay, so then we get 0, 1, and actually let's just put this on one line like this. So you see that corresponds to one triangle. Okay, then we'll go into the next line, 1, 2, 3. Okay, and then that's it. So then what we'll do is, let's bring our mesh filter down here, and we'll say shared mesh equals mesh. Okay, so now we've got our quad. And now let's go back into Unity, let that compile. And we'll just create like a game object to put this on. And let's add our quad. And as I said, we gotta make sure we've got the mesh filter on there already. And let's add a mesh renderer as well. Though the code doesn't refer to that, we want to actually have something that's drawing it. And let's just throw a default. Doesn't seem to want to draw that. So let's use something that it's able to draw. And so I'm looking through the different materials here. It doesn't look like there's just like a basic unlit material. So let's see if we can just add one like that really quick to the project. We'll get into materials and that type of thing in the next lesson. But let's just add like a basic unlit material. And we'll use an URP, which I have this project set up in unlit. Okay, perfect. This is exactly what I'm looking for. So let's throw that on here. And then there's no mesh assigned. So let's now right click here, which is that context menu item I added, and click build mesh. And oh, that looks like a quad there. And there we go. So you can see there, we made our quad. So I know it's very exciting for our first lesson, but honestly, if you really understand what was going on there, you're off on the right track. Okay, I mean, and if you don't understand, especially with this indices thing, this can be sort of counterintuitive when you're first starting. So don't worry about that. Hopefully, we'll continue sort of building your understanding of that a little bit, but. It seems simple, but we'll be off on the right track coming from here. So like a final note here before we move on to the next lesson is that if you notice here, the forward vector is kind of pointing away from where our surface is. And if you look on the back side, you'll see there's nothing being drawn there, right? So if we wanted our mesh to be, I actually kind of like that it's pointing away from the forward vector, but let's say, kind of no reason that I like that in particular. But let's say we wanted it to work the other way. What you would do is change the winding order of this. And so maybe what I can do is actually, before I do that, let's just show on the MS Paint what that looks like. So rather than going 0, 1, 3, and we're going clockwise, let's say we're going 0, 3, 1. Now we're going counterclockwise, right? And so if you just change the order of two of these things, then that's what we'll get. And then 1, 3, 2. 1, 3, 2. Now we're going counterclockwise, right? So if we change that and then we come back here and oops, wrong thing to right click. We build mesh. Now it's not showing on that side. And now we can go over to this side and we can see that it's rendering on this face that's kind of in the same direction as its forward vector. So that's kind of what I was talking about before with the winding order, is that I usually use clockwise probably, but then maybe I didn't draw it and I'm not visualizing it properly in my mind, and then, okay, I need to adjust that. But it should be pretty simple to play around. That's one of the things that I really like about graphics programming, is that it's easy to play around and see what you get. So even this is I think it's kind of cool. I think it's kind of satisfying to just code something up and then something just appears like that. Um, hopefully you're finding it somewhat cool, and we'll get into more of these lessons and we can start seeing some more cool stuff. Okay, great. See you in lesson 2.